Greetings. Here's a Bally Playboy pinball machine from 1978. This was the first generation of solid-state games that Bally built. I think development on these started in either 73 or 74, and the first machine hit the market in 76. Before this, everything was electromechanical. You got a schematic with the machine, and that was deemed enough for you to fix things. But things got more complicated once we turned to solid state. Play feels relatively simple. Everything, the lamps are all incandescents, and there's not a whole lot happening on the play field as far as features are concerned. Nonetheless, Bally knew how to build machines, and they were still a whole lot of fun. But what we're going to do today is have a look at some of the electronics, and since this was a big jump for the operators and distributors to all of a sudden they had to become solid-state repair persons, and we're going to look at some of the equipment and the efforts that Bally put into this to make it possible for the operator and the distributor to fix these machines. Now, I've kept this machine as original as possible, as evident by the light bulbs, by the incandescents. The originals, the one part that I gave in on and went modern are the displays. These used to be numeric gas plasma displays that these things are old, very, very old, over 40 years, and they are all dying a slow and painful death, and nobody's making them anymore. So fortunately, one thing they've done is they've made what you're looking at are LED displays. And they've done a really good job because the color is dead on. The camera falsifies it a bit, but it's a medium orange. And looking at it from a distance, or if you didn't know any better, it fools a lot of people into thinking that those are the original displays. Let's look inside. I removed the back glass, so everything except the transformer sits behind this panel that'll swing open for service. And here are the electronics. As you can see, they filled up this back box. Top left is a CPU board. Top right is a voltage regulator board, lamp driver board, sound board, and I lied on this one. The transformer is actually in the back box too, so the only thing in the cabinet is the speaker. So what we are going to concentrate on is the CPU board. What did Bally do to make it possible for people to repair these things? Brand new field. Solid-state electronics was brand new for most people who had dealt with electromechanicals all of their professional lives. Let's do a quick walkthrough of what's on this board. So this early 70s is basically a microcomputer board. I mean, you probably heard of the Altair, the first PC that was user programmable, and really the only difference between an Altair and this, other than, of course, the Altair had an 8080 and this has a 6800 on it, was that this was not meant to be a user programmable computer. They built a computer board, but it didn't have a keyboard, didn't have a CRT display or anything like that, because they just programmed the ROMs and it ran a pinball machine for you. And thus I think the people who designed these never got the credit they deserve, because Alright, it wasn't a consumer item per se, even though this is what let you play the pinball machine. But to go over it quickly, as mentioned, we have a Motorola 6800 8-bit processor. We have two 6821 PIAs. PIA standing for Parallel Interface Adapter. And a pinball machine, as you can imagine, needs lots of digital lines, controls lots of things in the real world. Well, in the real pinball world. Light bulbs, solenoids, it reads switches, and whatever else is required. And the external signals are basically conditioned over here. This is all basically transmission line theory that makes sure that the signal coming out of here and traveling through a jungle of wire harnesses is kept as clean as possible. Two EEPROMs, a 1K and a 2K. You'll notice that there's a whole bunch of EEPROM spaces over here, and on these machines later on, these weren't even populated with sockets, because the reason there's 6 sockets here, or 6 places to put in EEPROMs, was the early ones would utilize 512 byte proms, because nothing, I mean, bigger proms existed, but they were very expensive. But by 1978, the 2716 had already come into play, and thus, for a machine like Playboy, which had a total of, let's see, we have 2K and 4, had a total of 6K of firmware on it. Other than that, memory-wise, we have this chip here, which is a 128 byte static RAM chip. And we have this guy over here, which is a 256 nibble RAM chip, a nibble being 4 bits, of course. They did this kind of stuff because RAM was still expensive, and they figured that in the beginning they only needed 4 bits for this guy, and thus they used them instead of putting 2 of them in there. This was battery backed. It's a CMOS chip, so it kept high scores and stuff like that, so when the machine was power cycled, your high scores would still be in there. And then it also used dip switches to set options such as how many balls per play, how many plays per coin, and that sort of stuff. So this is it. This describes the board. And now finally let's get to the diagnostic part. And that brings us to the actual subject of today's video, the Bally MPU test set, which was a device built specifically for helping in troubleshooting the CPU board that we just saw. It is housed in a beautiful brown wooden box. Has a whole lot of cables coming out of it, profusion of buttons on it, including a power switch and a momentary test switch, and not much else. Now, I've had this for a while. I bought this in a horrible state a few months ago, and basically spent a long time restoring it, making it functional, and adding whatever parts had been robbed from it. I didn't document it in video because it didn't have a very high priority for me to get fixed immediately, so I put in a little bit of time whenever I had some time left over, and it spanned over several months. So I gave up filming it, but we can talk about the results today. Now, this is not an autonomous tester, and what I mean by that is this doesn't have a CPU in it. It's almost like an expansion card that you plug into the CPU board, and then it gives the CPU board new firmware to run. Instead of running a pinball machine, it runs something that tests itself. So you can raise the hood and see what's inside. Pretty large PC board, a single transformer, but it generates two sources of 5 volts, one for the device under test and one for itself. New firmware has circuitry that switches out whatever EPROMs are on the test unit and switches these EPROMs in, some decoding logic, and a profusion of 6821 PIAs, and then of course wires that need to be plugged into the device that you're testing. Now, the purpose of this is the very first thing, or one of the very first things they tell you in the manual is make sure that your CPU board is running, which of course sounds kind of weird. Well, this is a tester, you know. I mean, I want to find out why. I have a board that doesn't power up. Why doesn't it power up? But as I mentioned before, it's not an autonomous tester. It can't really do anything on its own. As you can see, no processor in here. But if the board you have at least powers up, but then does funny things, then this will help you along to troubleshoot it. Now here's what the test setup looks in action. You just put the CPU board onto the pegs on top, and then you start plugging things into it, and use the high-res display to tell you what's going on. But a little bit of explanation again. The board has to be running in order for this to work, for this to do anything. And you may rightfully say that, what is it good for? And really what it's good for, it'll test a bunch of things, but the CPU board has a self-test in it which does most of that. The most important part that this tester fulfills is when it's testing, let's say the onboard, it has some diagnostics onboard, it tests these PIAs. But all it can do is it can write values to it and then read back the internal registers to see if it took the values. This has no way of reading if what's coming out of the PIAs or what's going into the PIAs. This has no way of testing that if the board's sitting in a machine. So what this tester really does, if you remember those 5 PIAs inside, it actually gives the processor access to all of the I/O pins of these 2 chips. So now the processor can read and write to this chip and then see if the actual values expected are appearing or not, or if any of the interface lines are bad. That's basically the function of this. But yeah, let's go on. One thing we didn't talk about is connectors. So the board has these 4 connectors on the sides that are hooked up to the wire harness that goes inside the machine. But then it also has this big connector back here, and that's not connected to anything when it's inside a pinball machine. So what this is actually the test connector for the CPU board, and in comes the last component of the tester, which I'll have to plug in. But no, let's leave this out for now. You may have seen this board. That doesn't look like it doesn't match the PC board color. It doesn't look like it came with it. Well, this is an integral part of the tester because this hooks up to the test connector on the CPU board. Except when you buy these things nowadays, if you're lucky enough to find one, the MPU interface card is almost always missing. That's because it is only physically connected to the tester through a ribbon cable, and that can be easily removed, and this card goes away. And I knew that when I bought it, and that's why it took me a long time to restore it, because of course nothing in it worked. The insides were corroded, the wires were corroded, everything was bad, and then this whole board was missing. And you can't find them. Nobody's making them yet, because this is not a high volume item for people to make it worth their while to reproduce the PCB. So I just built a prototype. The schematics are available, so I just followed the schematics and built this guy to complete the tester. As a first test, let's pretend that this board is not sitting in the tester, but rather inside the pinball machine. So what happens when you turn on power? You'll notice that I only have this connector in, none of the other connectors. And the reason for that is all that this does for now is supply power to the CPU board. There's really not much else. There's some other lines in here, but obviously they're not going to get used. So what we can do is demonstrate how the CPU self-tests itself. And if we want to look at this LED. So I'm turning on power, and we can see every blink signifies that it tested something. And if you get 7 blinks, then you basically have the CPU board passes its own internal test. Now I didn't count blinks last time, but basically you should see a brief flash and then 7 blinks. And if you get 7 blinks, then the board thinks it's okay. If you get less than 7 blinks, then you count how many blinks you got, and the manual tells you what it's pointing to. Is it RAM? Is it a PIA? Is it interrupts not happening? That sort of stuff. So let's have a look at it now. Flash 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Boom. So that will let the machine boot up and run. And now if you don't get all of the blinks, it is still considered that the CPU is running. So now you can start using the tester to figure out, why things aren't working. But when it's fully functional like this, here's what we can do to run a full test. Okay, now everything is plugged in. We can see 4 sets of edge connectors here plugged in, and the MPU interface plugged into the test connector over here, and then running through the ribbon cable inside the machine. And really all that's on this board are bidirectional buffers. Really nothing really exciting in there. I used original chips, which were not all that easy to find, but instead of using 74 chips, it uses the 8T series of buffers. But it's all plugged in. And now, okay, what should happen for it to work? Or if it's hooked up correctly, our infamous green LED should blink twice. That means everything's electrically connected and it's running the firmware inside here. So here we go, 3, 2, 1 on, and we got 2 blinks. So it is ready to test. When I was restoring it, believe me, it took me several weeks to look forward to seeing those 2 blinks, which just didn't want to happen. And a funny anecdote is I had fixed up everything inside, changed sockets, put new chips, and it just didn't want to work. And as a last step, I did the obvious. There are 2 EEPROMs in there. I had the EEPROMs in the wrong place. I had B and A and B. I finally looked at the code when it still wasn't working to see why, if I could figure out how far it was getting, if I put a logic analyzer on it and all of that. And when I read the code, I went, yeah, this is these two EEPROMs are plugged into the wrong sockets. I swapped them, and I saw the beautiful double blink of the green LEDs. All right, so here's what things look like. We turn it on. We got the two blinks. We got the display, which unfortunately the upper left segment here is really, really weak. And I got to rebuild that someday, real soon. But nah, you can still read it. Camera kind of hides it, but if you turn down the lights a bit, you can see that segment too. So now all we do is we hit the test button. So it's doing something. And now, all of a sudden, it's complaining about U7. Now, one thing I need to point out to you, even though it's restored and seems to work, all of these wires, I have not replaced the contacts in all of the connectors, which is probably what I need to do. And because of that, it throws some errors, which tend to go away. Or maybe not. Let's see. Again. Okay. So the U7 error went away. It was obviously telling me that IC U7 had a problem. Then it showed a 2. And the 2 signifies that if you look at this board, it's a dash 35 revision. The very first revision, production revision, was a dash 17. If you have a dash 17 board, the display will show you a 1. If you have a dash 35, it will show you a 2. So it did that. But now it's saying a J122. And what that means is J12 pin 2 is bad. So it's telling us that one of the PIA lines is not working correctly. I squarely blame that. I mean, I sprayed the contacts with contact cleaner and all of that. This board works perfectly. But actually, maybe that one I/O line is bad. And since this one has ROMs set up for Playboy, maybe Playboy doesn't use that I/O line, because not all machines use all of the I/O lines. But, you know, so it is kind of useful because it tells me that that line isn't working correctly. And if I re-EEPROM this and run KISS or something else with it, and there's funny things with lights not coming on or things missing, then this is pointing us directly at what the error is. And it will continue testing. It will go through all of the I/O lines and pause every time it hits a bad one. So if we hit this button again, boom. So what the 9999 means is test completed. So all this did was it told us that one of the I/O lines is bad, and the manual kind of guides you towards what J12 pin 2 or whatever it was that popped up is. And then you can start swapping PIAs, checking traces on the board, and that kind of fun stuff. So let's, for grins, just run it again and see. So it goes back to 0, so testing it. That keeps coming back, so there may actually be something wrong. Or is it I'm sorry, that's not J12 2, that's J1 pin 22. So, and J1 is, J1's the big guy over here, and 22, this is 28, so 22 would be somewhere here. So one last try, see if by bending it or something, because I think that error is caused not by a board error, but rather by something bad on the on the contacts inside that connector. But hey, let's go on. Passed, end the test, start a test. Board type 2 keeps getting back to J122. So, well, one other thing we can do is test another board. Okay, I brought a different board. This one's configured for the KISS pinball machine. It's all plugged in. This is also a -35 board, so this one should, first thing it should show us after starting the test is the 02. And let's see if this complains about anything, gives us an error that starts with a J. So, that's interesting. It didn't blink twice. The LED just came on. Let's see why that is. And it's because there is no CPU plugged in to the CPU socket. So let's fix that. Alright, I corrected that minor oversight. Did I plug it in right? Right orientation? Yeah. Okay, this time let's watch the diagnostic LED and make sure it blinks twice. Good. Amazing what happens when you put a CPU in the right socket. So we're back at the 0 here, and we'll start the test. There's our 2. Now look at that. It's giving us the exact error code on a different machine. So I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that something inside the box is not working correctly, or there's I'd have to look at the connector, at the wire in 22. Let's see if I yank on it and give it one more chance. Well, we don't even know if that's the only error it'll come up with. Yep, that's it. So last chance before it goes to the landfill. It was only a bad joke. Of course, this is never going to the landfill. I mean, look at it. It's a thing of beauty. And they're kind of rare because these weren't, not too many, I don't think not too many operators bought one. I think Bally made every distributor buy a set because they make one for the MPU, for the displays, to the solenoid driver, for the lamp driver, for soundboards, la 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 la. I don't know how much these were, but yeah, they weren't giving them away for free to the distributors anyway. So, but hey, I got one. There it is. Another shot from all angles so you can admire the beauty. Well, thanks for watching. Here I think this gave you a good idea of where diagnostics were at, what automated test equipment did in the mid-70s on consumer items. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell. Leave me a comment, and we'll see you next time.